The room was too quiet for Buckingham Palace on a weekday afternoon. Usually, there is a low, constant hum, footsteps on thick carpet, the quiet ticking of antique clocks, aides moving with deliberate speed down long, portrait-lined corridors. But inside the king's private study, the air felt dense and motionless. On the mahogany desk lay a small, unlabeled digital recorder. Next to it sat a single sheet of heavy parchment bearing the royal coat of arms. Charles didn't pick up the recorder. He didn't need to. He had already listened to the file twice, and every word had burned itself into his memory. It wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't an emotional outburst or a moment of careless gossip. That, at least, he might have found a way to forgive. What made the recording unbearable was its cold, methodical calm. Before we dive in deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single palace update. The voice on the tape belonged to someone who sat at his table, shared his private space, and knew the exact weight of the crown he wore. On the tape, that voice spoke with quiet precision about palace operations. It detailed plans to reshape public perception, influence succession messaging, and slowly adjust the public standing of the Prince and Princess of Wales. It spoke of managing the press, controlling access, and subtly altering the ceremonial ranking of the royal household, all to consolidate influence behind closed doors while the king was focused on his public duties. It was not a scandal driven by affection or misguided defense. It was a calculated strategy for power. Two senior private secretaries stood near the doorway, as rigid as statues. Neither of them offered an opinion, and Charles didn't ask for one. Some burdens belonged entirely to the sovereign. For years, the king had tried to balance the demands of an ancient institution with the personal loyalty he felt toward the woman who had stood beside him through decades of public scrutiny. He had fought battles for her, weathered fierce public resentment, and insisted on her place within the royal family when few believed she would ever reach it. Yet sitting in that dimly lit room, staring at the paper on his desk, the realization hit him with absolute clarity. The threat wasn't coming from external critics or hostile press. It was moving within his own home. If he swept this under the rug to protect his marriage, the integrity of the crown would be compromised. The line between personal affection and constitutional duty would blur, and the trust he was bound to preserve would erode from the inside out. If he acted, he would be delivering a blow to his own private life, from which there would be no recovery. Charles picked up his fountain pen. His hand hesitated for a fraction of a second over the paper, a private directive instruction that would strip Camilla of her official title privileges, suspend her ceremonial status, and freeze her involvement in household governance. The order would not be shouted from a podium or announced with fanfare. It would move through the palace administrative channels like a silent blade. With a slow, deliberate movement, he signed his name at the bottom of the document. He placed the pen down and didn't look up at the secretaries. "Deliver this directly to Clarence House," the king said, his voice flat and hushed, stripped of any emotion. "Ensure it is executed immediately." A few miles away, at Clarence House, the afternoon was unfolding with its usual quiet routine. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows onto cream-colored sofas and polished side tables. Camilla sat at her desk, reviewing a stack of correspondence for her upcoming patronages. When the door opened, her private secretary didn't knock with his usual rhythm. He entered slowly, carrying a sealed leather folder. He didn't offer a greeting, nor did he make eye contact, as he placed the folder on the desk in front of her. "From the king, ma'am," he said softly, before stepping back toward the door. Camilla looked at the folder. She knew the protocol of the household better than almost anyone. A leather folder delivered by hand, without an accompanying verbal briefing, meant only one thing: an official royal command. She unsealed the clasp and opened the document. Her eyes moved across the formal text, catching the sharp, unmistakable phrases: suspension of title privileges, removal from ceremonial sequence, immediate review of official roles. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop the paper or cry out. Decades of living in the public eye had taught her how to build an impenetrable wall over her emotions, and that wall held firm. But beneath the desk, her knuckles turned white as her hands clenched into tight fists. Her face went pale, her lips pressing into a thin, tight line. The shock was not loud. It was deep and freezing. The man who had spent 40 years shielding her from every storm had just raised his hand and drawn the line himself. She saw her own name on the page, stripped of the titles she had spent a lifetime fighting to earn, reduced to a subject of an internal administrative review. She folded the document back up with precise, deliberate care, aligning the edges until they matched perfectly. She placed it neatly on the center of her desk. "Is there a response, ma'am?" the secretary asked quietly from the doorway. Camilla raised her head, her gaze sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of panic. "No," she said, her voice steady and controlled. "There is no response." She turned her eyes back toward the window, staring out into the garden as the heavy silence of Clarence House settled around her like lead. The decision was made, the order was signed, and across the palace, the gears of the institution were already turning. When Prince William arrived at Buckingham Palace, he did not walk with the hurried pace of a son responding to a family emergency. His step was deliberate, measured, and stripped of dramatic expression. The guards at the private entrance stood at attention, sensing that the atmosphere inside the residence had shifted overnight from routine formality to something heavy and cold. Inside the king's study, the morning light had barely broken through the tall, draped windows. Charles was seated behind his desk, looking older, his hands resting flat against the leather blotter. William stopped a few feet short of the desk, meeting his father's eyes. Between them lay an unspoken history. William was not simply a member of the family. He was the heir, the living representative of what came next. Every misstep, every factional battle, and every internal compromise made in the present would eventually land on his shoulders. Charles gestured toward the document summary placed neatly beside the digital recorder. "You need to review this," the king said quietly, "not as my son, as the Prince of Wales." William picked up the pages. As he read through the transcripts, his expression remained impassive, but his jaw tightened slightly. The recorded conversations outlined an effort to quietly adjust the official standing of his household, subtly shifting the line of public focus, controlling messaging around the future reign, and placing quiet pressure on how Catherine was positioned within the ceremonial order. It was a direct attempt to undermine the future stability of the monarchy to secure short-term control in the present. "How far has this spread?" William asked, his voice low, controlled, and sharp. "It stops here," Charles replied. "The directive is signed. Her privileges are frozen." "A suspension isn't enough if the machinery behind it remains intact," William said, looking up from the paper. "If people in this building believed they could quietly negotiate the standing of my family, then the boundary was erased a long time ago." Before Charles could answer, the door opened without a formal announcement. Princess Anne stepped into the room. The Princess Royal did not waste time with soft openings. She wore a sharp, tailored coat, her posture immaculate, her presence carrying the unyielding pragmatism that had defined her decades of service. She closed the door firmly behind her, looked at the two men, and walked straight to the desk. "I've read the administrative summary," Anne said, her tone dry and completely devoid of sentiment. "It is messy, it is short-sighted, and it is entirely unacceptable." She looked at Charles, offering no gentle comfort for the personal toll the decision was taking on him. "You did what was necessary by signing the order, Charles, but do not make the mistake of hesitating now. Half measures in a situation like this look like weakness, and weakness invites further speculation. If you cut the line, you cut it cleanly." "She believes the recording was taken out of context," Charles said softly, a trace of weariness breaking through his composure. "Context does not matter when the authority of the institution is tested," Anne shot back instantly. "The moment private ambition touches public duty, the choice is made for you. We cannot afford an internal Cold War while trying to run a monarchy. Clear the schedule, enforce the directive, and let the household adjust." Anne's blunt assessment grounded the room. She turned to William, giving a single firm nod. Your priority is your household and the continuity of the line. Charles knows what must be done. As Anne left the study to oversee the immediate administrative adjustments, the root cause of the crisis hung heavily in the air. This fracture had not begun with a recording. The tape had merely confirmed what both men had noticed months earlier at the Windsor Legacy reception. It had been a high-profile formal event meant to highlight the continuity of the royal family. But minutes before the doors opened to foreign dignitaries and government officials, a quiet alteration had been made to the official sequence. Catherine's name had been moved down the formal line of reception, placing her below the consort's immediate private circle. To an outsider, it was a minor detail of event management. To the palace, where ceremonial order is the literal language of power and rank, it was an intentional, quiet assertion of dominance. William had watched an aide quietly swap the place cards on the tray, catching Catherine's brief, guarded look of realization. She had said nothing, choosing complete dignity over a public scene, but William had known then that an invisible line had been crossed. Now, that boundary was being permanently restored. An hour later, Charles stood in the private sitting room at Clarence House. The atmosphere was stifling. Camilla stood near the fireplace, upright, her hands clasped in front of her. The quiet shock of the previous afternoon had hardened into sharp, guarded frustration. You are letting aides and cold summaries destroy decades of work, she said, her voice tight as she looked at him. People around me spoke loosely. It was administrative chatter, nothing more. Words were taken from private conversations and framed to look like treason. Charles stood his ground, refusing to sit. The distance between them felt vast, filled with the weight of the signed decree resting in his coat pocket. It was not loose chatter, Camilla, Charles said, his voice dropping to a stern, absolute register she had rarely heard from him in private. It was planning. It touched upon the positioning of my son, his wife, and the future of the crown itself. I have stood by you through every public storm this country could throw at us, she insisted, stepping forward, her composure cracking for a brief second. And you surrender my position over an internal recording? You let them strip my name off official duties as if I were a risk to your reign? The crown is not a personal possession we can split to keep the peace at home, Charles answered, the monarch completely overtaking the husband. You asked if I believed you intended to harm me. Intention no longer matters. The integrity of the household was placed in danger under your authority, and I have answered it. So there is no discussion? She asked, her voice dropping into a cold, wounded quiet. No compromise? The directive is signed, Charles said softly, looking at her one last time before turning toward the door. The decision is final. The administrative engine of the palace moves not with sudden drama, but with quiet, devastating precision. By the following morning, the king's signed directive had filtered down through the private offices, far from the polished reception rooms and grand staircases. In the printing office at Clarence House, a stack of official programs for the upcoming Commonwealth reception sat on a heavy wooden workbench. An aide quietly picked up the top draft, picked up a pen, and drew a single line through the consort's name. Hours later, new proofs arrived, where her title and official styling had previously been printed in gold ink. At the top of the order of arrival, there was only a clean, empty margin. No announcement was made to the lower staff. No memo was distributed explaining the change. But as the revised schedules circulated among private secretaries, equine officers, and security details, everyone understood the silence. A missing line on an official program was the royal equivalent of a sentence passed. Patronages were quietly notified that scheduled appearances were under internal review, and key ceremonial duties were frozen midstream. Before we reveal how Catherine answered the call to step forward, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update on this unfolding story. At Kensington Palace, Catherine sat at her desk, reviewing the updated briefing papers for the Commonwealth event. Prince William stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the rain hit the glass. The air between them was quiet, filled with the sobering realization that the scandal had now breached the outer walls of the family. The telephone on Catherine's desk rang. It was the King's private secretary, calling directly from Buckingham Palace. The request was brief and carefully worded. The King was asking the Princess of Wales to step into the primary host role at the Commonwealth reception, taking over the exact ceremonial placement, greetings, and official duties that had been stripped from Camilla. Catherine paused, her hand resting on the edge of the desk. She knew the optics of the moment. To the outside world, stepping into that space could easily be framed as a political victory, a public dynamic of one woman replacing another after an internal clash. She knew how people might interpret it: revenge, ambition, or a quiet assertion of dominance. "Tell the King I will carry out the duty," Catherine said softly, her voice calm and absolute. When she hung up the phone, William turned to look at her. "You don't have to carry the weight of this public shift alone," he said quiet. "It isn't about taking a side, William," Catherine answered, looking at him with steady resolve. "The event cannot look fractured. If the institution appears unsteady right now, the damage spreads to everyone, including the children. It has to be handled with dignity, or it shouldn't be done at all." She accepted the role not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet, serious discipline of someone who understood that continuity mattered more than personal feelings. Outside the heavy iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was entirely different. By mid-morning, word of the sudden administrative changes had leaked into the broader public atmosphere. The morning papers had printed stark front-page photos of the royal residences under bold, stark headlines questioning the sudden absence of the consort from official schedules. A crowd gathered along the mall, pressing against the stone pillars and black railings. Tourists and passers-by stood with their phones raised, pointing toward the high windows, whispering and debating what had happened behind the quiet facades. Broadcasters stood on makeshift platforms near the Victoria Memorial, piecing together the subtle clues: the sudden removal of titles from the official website, the quiet cancellation of joint engagements, and the unusual shift in Catherine's schedule. To the public outside, it was a massive, mysterious upheaval, a sudden rupture in the image of a stable, unified royal household. Inside the palace walls, however, the response to the growing storm was total, unbroken restraint. In the long gallery, footmen moved quietly, adjusting portraits and preparing the rooms for the evening's reception, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. There were no hushed arguments in the hallways, no rushed meetings in view of the windows, and no emotional displays from the senior figures. Charles walked through the staterooms alone shortly before the guests were set to arrive. He paused briefly at the entrance to the main ballroom, looking at the arranged seating, the carefully placed floral arrangements, and the empty space beside his own marked chair. The personal toll was written clearly in the deep lines around his eyes, but his posture remained rigid. When the doors were finally opened and the international guests began to arrive, Catherine stepped into the room alongside William. She wore a simple, elegant gown, moving through the receiving line with practiced grace, greeting foreign dignitaries and high commissioners with warmth and composure. Every movement she made was steady, polished, and entirely devoid of drama. She filled the void left by the crisis without acknowledging that a void existed at all. From a high window overlooking the courtyard, an aide watched the reception unfold. Below, the King stood beside the Prince and Princess of Wales, presenting a unified, steady front to the world. The shift was complete. The storm outside the gates continued to grow, but inside, the adaptation was already finished. Cold, quiet, and permanent. The heavy velvet drapes in the King's private office at Clarence House were drawn against the evening damp, shutting out the dull glow of London below. The palace had grown quiet again, the immediate flurry of administrative adjustments giving way to a silence that felt heavier than the crisis itself. On the desk rested a final document, not an official decree for public view, but a private entry binding the decision to the internal archives of the duchy and the sovereign's private record. Charles sat alone at the mahogany desk, his glasses resting beside an unsealed leather binder. He picked up his pen one last time and drafted a brief, formal letter addressed directly to Camilla. There was no harshness in the script, nor was there any room left for appeal. The wording was exact, stripped of emotion, confirming that the suspension of her title privileges, official household duties, and ceremonial status was permanent. It noted that the decision had been formally entered into the permanent royal record, a document preserved for future generations of courtiers, historians, and monarchs. The letter was not meant to inflict further pain. It was written to draw a clear, unyielding line. In the ancient logic of the monarchy, an unresolved dispute is a vulnerability. By entering the decree into the official record, Charles ensured that no future shift in personal affection or private pleading could quietly reverse what duty had demanded. When the letter was delivered to Camilla's private quarters, she did not send a reply. She read the final lines slowly, placed the page inside her desk drawer, and turned off the lamp. The long fight for acceptance, recognition, and position, a journey that had spanned half a lifetime and weathered relentless public judgment, had ended not with a public battle, but with the turn of a key in a quiet room. At its core, the entire ordeal was a stark reminder of the solitary rule that has governed the British monarchy for centuries. Personal feelings, deep romantic loyalties, and private devotions must always yield to the preservation of the crown. For Charles, the choice had been agonizing. He was a man who had spent decades defying public opinion and palace tradition to protect the woman he loved. Yet, when faced with evidence that internal maneuvering threatened the stability of the succession and the integrity of the institution, the monarch was forced to override the husband. The crown is not merely a family heirloom or a symbol of prestige, it is a constitutional trust. To allow private ambition to reshape the hierarchy from within would be to undermine the very foundation of the sovereign's authority. The sacrifice was total, cold, and absolute. It demonstrated that no matter how much the modern world views the royal family through the lens of personal drama and individual happiness, the institution itself recognizes only one imperative: survival. As the dust settled over the household, the true weight of the resolution settled upon each key figure in distinct, permanent ways. Camilla found herself in a state of profound isolation. Though she remained legally married to the king, her public role had been erased. The patronages she had championed, the ceremonial presence she had built, and the hard-won titles that signaled her place at the center of royal life were gone. She existed now in the quiet shadows of the royal estate, a figure defined no longer by her proximity to power, but by the boundary the king had drawn around her. Charles carried the heartbreak of a man who had saved his kingdom by wounding his own home. He continued his public duties with the same steady, deliberate composure he had always shown, but those close to him noted a new, permanent weariness in his demeanor. He had proven his strength as a monarch, but the personal cost was a shadow that would hang over the remainder of his reign. He had chosen the crown, and in doing so, he had accepted the loneliness that comes with wearing it. For Prince William, the crisis served as a solemn, sobering warning. Standing alongside Catherine, as they assumed the full burden of representing the future of the monarchy, the Prince of Wales saw clearly the weight of the crown he would one day inherit. He had seen how quickly internal trust could erode and how ruthless the institution must be when its continuity is threatened. The lesson was etched into his approach to his own household: discipline, absolute alignment, and an uncompromising focus on the stability of the next generation. And yet, despite the personal heartbreak, the shattered trusts, and the quiet grief lingering in the corridors of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, the crown itself remained standing. The institution had absorbed the shock, adjusted its ranks, and moved forward, impassive, enduring, and unbroken. Thank you for following this deep dive into one of the most intense, hidden chapters of modern royal history. The story of power, loyalty, and duty inside the palace walls is a constant reminder of how much lies beneath the surface of official appearances. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay informed on every major development, story, and palace update, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. Your support helps us bring you more in-depth coverage. Before you go, we want to hear your thoughts on how this crisis unfolded. Drop a comment below and let us know. Do you think King Charles made the right choice by prioritizing the crown over his marriage, or should he have handled the situation privately? Was Princess Anne correct in pushing for immediate, unyielding action, or was the decision to strip title privileges too harsh? How do you think Prince William and Catherine handled stepping into the void left by this crisis? Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.